everybody, and welcome to Coffee Time Talk. It's a real pleasure today to welcome Dr. Gerald Boalch, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with within the MBA. He's a regular feature in the common room in one particular chair in the top left corner, which we're all keeping warm for you, Gerald, during these COVID times. And lots of people have been really happy to hear that you'll be coming along to have a question and answer session and to hear some of the stories about the MBA. So let's start in the very early days, Gerald. So you started your early years in beer. So was that where you sort of had your first kind of connections with the sea and with seaweeds, or where did it all start?
Yes, my father was a fish merchant. My grandfather had been a fisherman, and so I was tied in with the fishing boats all the time. I went to the primary school at Beer, and during the war, we used to go down on the shore at low tide and collect chondrus and gigatina to send off to make a substitute for agar. And this was my first introduction to looking at seaweeds. And I then realized that there were more than 2 species there. I started collecting. And when I went to the grammar school at Colleton, there was a very enlightened lady biology teacher, and she showed me how to press seaweeds. And I started collecting seaweeds and pressing them.
Wow. So have you got any of your early seaweed presses? And can you just sort of briefly explain what a seaweed press is and how you do it as well?
Well, it's the sort of thing you can only really demonstrate. But you collect your seaweed, you rinse them, get them clean. And now there's a bit of a controversy on the next session, because in the MBA, we always press from freshwater, whereas most people, the BM, etc., press from seawater. But the thing is, you float your seaweed out into the water and slide a piece of cartridge paper underneath, and then carefully lift the paper and spreading out the seaweed as you go, drain off all the water, and put the seaweed in a stack of drying paper with a piece of muslin or something on the top of the seaweed to stop it sticking to the drying paper, and you put it in a press. And when it's dry, you take it out, and that goes ready to go in the herbarium. Having written on the paper when you press the seaweed exactly where you collected it, when you collected it, and under what conditions.
And that's quite key, isn't it, to make sure that then that's a sort of historical record of where and when that seaweed was recorded, and then becomes a useful sort of herbarium for other scientists to be able to reference from.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a few seaweed presses. They can be a bit smelly as well, can't they? From experience as they're drying.
No, when they're drying, yes.
Yeah.
Once they're dry, there's no smell.
It's good to press them in the airing cupboard, but then sort of give the airing cupboard a bit of airing once it's been done as well.
Well, so, I know. I never put it in the airing cupboard.
Oh, really? I probably did that wrong. So phycology is your sort of field, Gerald. So can you tell us about your sort of early days at the MBA and starting your research in phycology?
Well, I went to University College London to do a BSc in botany. And my Professor Fogg, suggested that I should do a PhD. And he said we ought to try and grow a marine brown alga in the lab. And so I said, all right. And we arranged that I would try and work on ectocarpus. And I had to get a grant, which I managed to get from the I can't remember what it was called now, but the organisation that came before NERC.
Right.
And I came down to Plymouth after my BSc. I came down to Plymouth in 1955 to collect my ectocarpus and to talk with Mary Park about culturing. And I then went back to London, and for 3 years I cultured ectocarpus, and I managed to get it growing bacteria-free in the laboratory. In those days, we hadn't heard of viruses. I got it growing bacteria-free. Then I applied for a fellowship at the MBA for international paints, and I spent the next 3 years trying to stop ectocarpus growing on ships.
And that was around 1958, wasn't it, that you started working at the MBA?
1958, yes.
So what was the MBA like in those days when you first joined in 1958?
Oh, it was very different then than what it is now. Um, the building, the main old building, of course, was just the same, but the wings that are now botany and that didn't exist, and a lot of the buildings out at the back didn't exist. And there were two common rooms with a kitchen in between the two. And there was a common room for the scientists and a common room for the assistants. And the scientists used to come up to coffee in white coats, and the assistants came up in brown coats. And there was a very strict segregation.
And because we were discussing this when we were talking about your upcoming coffee time talk session, Gerald, and there was talk of a particular table where you weren't even allowed to look at those individuals unless you'd been invited to come over and talk to them. Is that right? What was the sort of the hierarchy in the common room?
No, it wasn't quite a hierarchy like that. But you came in with your senior research worker normally, and Mary Park sat up in the top corner where I now sit. And the thing was, whenever a visiting worker came to the lab, they were brought in by the person they were working with and introduced to everyone in their field. This was something that was very useful because you got to know what all the visitors were and what they were doing.
Yeah, that's quite a nice system. Maybe we should go back to that again.
Yeah, well, it would be a good system now, because we haven't got a clue who's in the building sometimes now.
Well, maybe we need to get some brown dye. I've got a couple of questions popping up, and there's some really interesting ones here that I'd really like to ask you, Gerald. So, linked to the brown coat, Cordelia's just asked, when did that end, and what do you think led to the change?
I think the change ended in about 1962 or 3 when the common room was converted into one room. And people that were not so conscious about wearing their coats coming up to coffee.
Okay.
Of course, J.Z. Young always came up to coffee in a white coat, which absolutely stank from all the operations he'd been doing on fish.
Right, okay. A recognisable smell throughout the MBA, I think.
Yeah.
And then sort of slightly going off at a tangent here as well. There's a question from Willy here, which I'd love to hear the answer on. So he's asking about a previous MBA director who photographed German latrines during the war, and do you know why he did this?
This was Sir Frederick Russell, who was the director. And in the First World War, he flew on little biplanes as an observer, leaning out of the plane taking photographs, and he became quite a big photographer. And they used his photographs of the enemy lines and that. And in the Second World War, he was called up as an intelligence officer. And on one occasion, somebody came to him and said, the army has received intelligence that the Germans are moving a battalion from A to B. We want to know how big a movement they're making. And he said, oh, it's quite easy. Go and take a photograph of the site, and I can count up the number of latrines. And
They weren't talking bowel movements there then.
I know that the Germans have a standard number per person, latrines. And so he said, we can exactly work out how many people are going to be there.
Wow, that's an interesting story. And it's actually his birthday coming up soon, I think, as well, because we were looking into him. Maggie has a really interesting presentation that she put together for the Royal History Society, I think it was, all about Frederick Russell.
Yeah.
So that's something that we might share on social media soon, a little bit of background on him. Quite a dashing fellow in his time as well.
Yeah, Freddie Russell was a very close friend of mine, because he'd been born in Dorset, not far from where I was born. And we had several links in common, and we both did watercolor painting in those days. And actually, when he retired, when he became ill, he went to a home in Reading, and I was going on a conference overseas, driving to Heathrow, and I called in to his home near Reading to see him. And he said, oh, I'm so glad to see you. the doctors just told me I got a fortnight to live. And I almost burst into tears. And he said, now come on, we're going to talk about the lab. We're not going to talk about what's happening to me. And I talked with him for about half an hour or so. And then I said, I'm sorry, but I got to go to catch my plane. He said, that's all right, I understand. I went off to my conference, and by the time I came back, he was dead.
Oh, yeah. I'd hear that he was a very well-loved man from the presentation, that he was well respected in the community.
Yes, and we always, when he was director, we always addressed him as Sir, of course. But then I met him on the corridor the day his announcement that he was made a knight. And as I passed him in the corridor, I said, oh, good morning, sir. I said, I've got to put an emphasis on the sir now. And he said, yes, but you'll find I haven't changed.
Well, don't give Willy any ideas. We'll all have to start calling him Sir soon as well. So we've got. Sorry.
Is Willy still there?
Yes, he is. Yeah.
Freddie Russell, when he was director, had a system where he would walk around the building every week, once around the building, and he would drop in on each scientist, sit down and say, what are you doing this week?
Wow, that would take some time now. That would be a few days of walking around. Did he deliver sort of nice gifts of cake or anything while he was doing it as well?
No.
Okay, and that's a really lovely story to hear about him, especially with his birthday coming up. So there's another question here from Rob Camp who's saying, do you know if there's any truth to the rumour that the MBA garden, which is now where the CPR building is, was populated with flowers and seeds from Kew Gardens? And you were just saying about a pear tree that you took of one of our historical scientists, Allison Wilson, who you took to Kew Gardens. So can you tell us about your home oak? Rob is asking, and also whether there is a connection with Kew Gardens there.
When the MBA building was built, the original building, Kew offered to give the lab a collection of plants. And a garden was set up where Safos building is now. And Kew provided the plants, including the holm oak and a bay trees and several other, and that little thing that grows along the drive, which is prostrate. I can't remember the Latin name. My memory of names is not good. But at one point, the holm oak had to be cut down because it was blocking the entrance to the store at the back, and it was diseased anyway. And I was bursar at the time, and I was very upset about losing this holm oak. But I found a seedling growing around the base of it, around the base of the citadel wall. I took it home and put it in a pot and surely nursed it until it grew to a decent size. And then we brought it in on a council day, and Tony Fogg planted it on the edge of the MBA ground. And it's now a rather bushy plant there.
Oh, wow. So whereabouts is that, Gerald?
On the smoking area. The little holm oak is the only holm oak that's there, you know it.
Oh, I'll have to go and have a look at that and see. I expect we'll all be out there later today at lunchtime to go and investigate the holm oak.
Instead of growing up like as a tree, it's been pruned and it's growing in a rather bushy form. But it's still the original holm oak. And when they built the Safos building, they dug out all the plants, and I brought the bay tree home and grew it, and it's still successors of it are still growing in my garden.
Oh, lovely. Oh, that's great. Nice. Then you were talking to me earlier just before we started about another lady that worked at the MBA, and Allison Wilson, who didn't officially work at the MBA because wives and ladies weren't allowed to work at the MBA. And you were saying that there was a connection with Kew Garden there. Do you want to just explain that one again for everybody?
Sorry?
Could you just explain about Allison Wilson again and her tree that you transferred to Kew Garden?
Allison Wilson was a professional botanist and a very good phycologist. But when she married DP, she wasn't allowed to work at the lab because wives weren't allowed to work in the same building as husbands. But she worked from home, and she also did a lot of work on the flora around Plymouth. And I've got her copy of a book which she used to use. And she was very interested in the Plymouth pear, and she grew a seedling from the one up at the Estover estate because they were threatened. And when she died, her husband gave me the seedling in a pot and said, "You better do something with it." So I drove up to London to Kew and handed it over to them in their care. And so there must be a Plymouth pear from Allison Wilson growing at Kew now.
Lovely. That's a nice kind of gift back to Kew Gardens, having had some of their plants earlier as well.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you as well. So you mentioned this to me just after the previous coffee time talk about our research vessels. I thought it was just coming past the window now, but it's not. It's the other one. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience on some of the historical research vessels, and particularly, I hear you've got some good stories about Sarsia as well.
Yeah. Yes. When I came, we had 3 ships. We had Sula, which was the most uncomfortable boat I've ever been on, and Gamrus, which is a little launch for working inshore, and the dear old Sarsia, which was rather an uncomfortable ship, but completely safe. And I used to go to sea in Sarsia about every 6 weeks, because with a chemist we did what we called a Western Channel survey. And we were away for 3 or 5 days, sometimes longer, depending on the weather. And in those days, of course, there was no mobile phones or email or anything like that. The only communication with the shore was with the radio telephone on the ship. And the captain jealously guarded that and wouldn't let anyone use it. So you went away on a cruise and your wife never knew what was happening and didn't even know when you're coming back.
Very different times.
The captain wouldn't allow you to send a message home. When I first started, I used to get dreadfully seasick, and I tried using my wife's prenatal morning sickness pills. They helped, but not completely. And then I found that when I was very ill on the ship one day, the fishing skipper came to me, or I was up on the bridge with him, and he said, "How are you?" And I said, "Oh, it's awful. I haven't eaten and it kept everything down for 3 days." Then he said, "Oh, well, never mind." He said to the steward who was there, "Go down and get Gerald a cup of coffee like mine, and then give him a good breakfast." And I shuddered and thought, what's going on? And the steward came up with this mug of black coffee, and I took one big gulp, and I realised that it was half coffee and half rum. So I drank this down on the fishing skipper's orders and went down, and I had a full breakfast, and I was completely fit after that.
Wow, so that's what we need to do on Sepia then. If anyone's suffering with seasickness, just give them a coffee and rum mixture.
Yeah. But after that, I used to take a hip flask of rum or brandy with me. And if I was really sick, I used to have a cup of coffee with some rum or brandy in. And on one occasion, we went out with Ian Butler on Sula, and Sula was the most uncomfortable ship you ever can think. Had a lab at the back, which was just a little box on the back, and it had a seat with a cushion on one side, and the other side was a workbench. And because it was on the trawler, it disturbed the balance of the trawler, and the trawler was very uncomfortable. And Ian and I went out to do a 24-hour survey on E1. And we went out in the morning, and we were sampling every hour until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it came on rather rough. And the skipper, who was old Bill Crease, and George Crease's father, came to me and he said, "I'm sorry, but the weather is so bad I can't stop the ship for you to take samples. I'm going to heave to." And I said, "Oh, that's all right, heave to." And he said, "I'll call you if ever it gets better." But he said, "It doesn't look very good." So Ian and I went down in the lab and we tossed, and I had the bench without the cushion on, and Ian had the cushion on the floor. And we drank my hip flask between us, rolled ourselves in oilskins, and lay down and went to sleep. And I lashed myself down because I was up on the bunk. I was frightened that I'd been thrown off. I lashed myself down, and we woke up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and found we were inside the breakwater.
Oh wow, that was nice to wake up to. You must have had quite a big hip flask there, Gerald, to sleep through that. That's great, great stories. I've got another question here from Heidi, which is a really lovely one. So the MBA is quite unusual being an independent research station. Why do you think the MBA has managed to survive and thrive for such a long time?
Oh, because they've had such a wonderful leader and council.
Yeah, you do need that strong leadership is very important, isn't it?
Yes, Freddie Russell was a wonderful leader, and after the war, he brought the lab into eminence. And of course, the MBA, when it first set up, had a field station up at Lowestoft, and that became the fisheries lab afterwards. And what is also said to be a problem, and I've never investigated this, is there were a certain amount of library books at Lowestoft which belonged to the MBA library, but when the ministry took it over as their fisheries lab, they never returned the books to us.
Oh, shame. And so how has the library developed in the time you've been here from 1958 to now? It's seen quite a lot of changes, hasn't it, over the
Oh, yeah,
period?
it's developed enormously, but of course now, sadly, everything seems to be online, and I'm very much against this. I think we should try and keep paper copies of all the journals, because someday the online system will crash.
And there's nothing like the smell of smelly old books as well, is there? There's something very addictive
Oh,
about
well,
it.
they're not smelly, and a lot of them are books that have been left by workers. In fact, in the library, of course, is my complete collection of reprints, which is in Matt Frost's room.
And your collection, your herbarium, which I'm still needing to go down and port my way through. So what sort of time period does your herbarium go from until, and what sort of collections have you got there? Is it just from Plymouth Sound, or does it go
Oh,
beyond there?
no, no, certainly not. Um, we've got a collection that Mary Park assembled, mainly from Plymouth. But on the other hand, in those days, the British Phycological Society used to hold a field meeting every summer, somewhere in the British Isles. And we went everywhere from the Channel Islands, Scillies, up to Shetland. And Mary Park and I always went on those field meetings, and we collected as complete a collection as we could from each site, and that's in the herbarium. And because I had the habit of collecting and pressing seaweeds, whenever I went away, whether it was on holiday or to a meeting, there was always a press in the bottom of the case. Shirley used to moan, but it was there, and I spent time collecting. And I collected in everywhere from China, South Africa, Chile, and those collections are in the herbarium as well.
Oh, we need to spend some time on your back end, Jared, to go and have a look, and you can talk to me all about them. But going back to what you've just said, so Willy came up with a question as you were talking then about Mary Park. So how did you get on with her? And he's saying that she was quite a formidable character.
Yes, it's rather interesting that when I came down in '58 to work at the lab, the British Phycological Society were running a book, a gambling book, because they didn't think I would last, and they were all betting how long I would last with Mary Park. But although we were both rather strong and forceful characters, we got to some sort of agreement. Occasionally we disagreed, but then we agreed to differ.
Hey, lovely. And so unfortunately, we're sort of running out of time now, but it's been lovely to hear so many stories from you, Gerald. Has anybody else got any other questions that they'd like to ask for Gerald? Oh, I've got one here actually, sorry, that I missed from Matt Frost, who's saying, can you tell us a bit more about the Old Aquarium? Good one, Matt. And saying, how busy was it with its locals and other people that would come and visit it?
The Old Aquarium was down in what is now the Resource Centre, and it was looked after by D.P. Wilson. And it was running, it was started soon after the lab was set up, because that park was originally used as a collection place for specimens, and there were so many inquiries from the public as to what was going on, it was decided to set up an aquarium and at least show people what we were doing. And so the aquarium was running, and D.P. Wilson was the guiding light in those days. He looked after it. And during the war, during the bombing, of course, the tanks all burst. The blast of the bomb cracked the glass and the water was all lost. But after the war, it was all set up again. And they had the Duke of Edinburgh came down to reopen it after the war.
I hear stories of eels being sort of on the floor as well. Wasn't there a large conger eel?
The fish were all, after the bombing, the fish were all over the place.
Yeah, great. Well, and I've got a question here from Cordelia, who's just asking about public's perception or attitudes towards marine science and how you think that changed since you began your career.
Oh, it's changed a lot. People are now respectful of scientists. When I started working at the lab, someone met my wife and said, "Oh, I understand your husband works up at the MBA." And she said, "Yes." And this woman said, "I thought they were all mad up there."
I think we probably are, aren't we? We've all got a little bit of madness to us, in a good way. Unfortunately, Gerald, I think on that note, we might have to end there. I'm going to stop recording now, but thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure we'll be able to answer a few more questions once we turn the recording off. But thanks very much, Gerald.
Right.